A few days ago, I was in a conversation with my family around the kitchen table. I just did a presentation a moment ago in which I reflected on part of that conversation. But one of my children, my son, replied to that my question. I asked them, do you remember the first time you heard the story of Jesus? And my son replied, part of his response was, would you give your life for your faith? Would you die as a martyr? What if someone had a family member of yours and with a gun to their head and said, you must renounce your faith or else your family member dies? What would you do? And that led, I think, to a very interesting conversation about, what is it that we are willing to die for? Is there anything that we're willing to die for as human beings? And I asked my son that question, what is it that you're willing to die for? And it's interesting to hear the things that people consider most valuable to them. For example, he mentioned, and I know I've had this conversation with others, where they feel very strongly about, I would die if I were falsely accused of something, before saying, admitting guilt, for instance. Let's say I'm falsely accused of a crime. Instead of admitting guilt to that crime, if I didn't do it, I would stand on principle and be willing to give my life for it. Or perhaps one of the things that was mentioned in the conversation was, I'd be willing to die for my country if we were under attack. To protect our country from others, I would be willing to give my life for that. But not sure that I'd be willing to give my life for my faith is part of what came out in the conversation. And so in the course of that dialogue, I brought up a couple of different stories. One was the story of the ancient martyr in the church, an 86-year-old man named Polycarp, who was willing to give his life as a martyr by being burned to death at a stake, rather than renounce his faith in Jesus. The people who were persecuting him and wanting him to renounce his faith, Roman authorities, insisted, they tried to get him, to give him opportunity to renounce his faith and save face. They said, you're an old man, you should die in a more dignified manner than this. But he said, how can I, Polycarp responds and says, how can I, Christ has been so good to me all of these years, how could I renounce my King and my Savior? And so his relationship with Christ, his belief in God, his deep faith and trust and relationship with God, I want to emphasize the word relationship, was so strong that he couldn't imagine denying his faith and turning away from Jesus to save his own life. He simply couldn't imagine that anymore. I also mentioned in the course of that conversation Peter in the New Testament, who denies that he even knows Jesus, although he feels very confident at first when Jesus says, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And Peter says, no, Lord, that's not going to happen. I'll give my life before I do that. And then Jesus, of course, predicts that he will deny his faith, and sure enough, Peter does. So apparently Peter thinks he's stronger than he is, and is not willing, when push comes to shove, he's not willing to give his life for his faith. But some 30 years or so later, he is willing to do so when he dies in Rome by being crucified. And so what I would suggest is that his faith grows deeper and deeper. In all of our lives, there are some things, I think, that are so deep at the core of who we are, that to be without them, or to not have them, or to deny them, would be a denial of who we are. The same thing can happen with our faith. The more I come to love God, and the more I come to love Christ, my Savior, like Polycarp, the deeper the relationship I have with God, the more interwoven it becomes to who I am. I can't imagine life without Christ. I can't imagine life not being a Christian. I'm not a perfect Christian by any stretch of the imagination, but I want to be. I want to be what Christ wants me to be. I want to follow him more dearly, more closely, more perfectly, more committedly. I want to be more deeply wrapped up together with and bound up together with Jesus. That desire that I have makes it more and more difficult as my life goes on to think about my life without Christ. And so back to the question about martyrdom, would I give my life? I don't want to be like Peter and hastily say, of course I would. I don't want to be, sort of presumptuous in that respect. What I do is I pray that God would give me the strength and the grace to stand for his truth and to be faithful to him until death, even if that means martyrdom. I want to be faithful to him because I love him and because I love his truth, and I have this bond and relationship with him that I don't want to be unfaithful to. And so we don't know what our future holds, but I hope that we could do that. And there are people, I suspect today, on planet Earth who will give their lives as martyrs because of how deeply their faith means to them, or how deep it is into their being and who they are, that they don't want to live without this faith, and therefore they're not willing to deny it. There are all kinds of great moral questions that come out of these conversations. We could talk about, whether a person that's holding a gun to your head, whether your act is even free under those circumstances, and can you be morally accountable for that? What about someone holding a family member and you're just wanting to save their life? There are all kinds of complexities on a moral front about martyrdom and about forced actions and so on. But my reflections here are simply in respect to reflecting on how deeply does my faith affect who I am? How much is it a part of my self-identity and my understanding of who I am as a human being? And I think that some reflection on that perhaps can give us some guidance as to where we are in our spiritual growth and where we are in respect to making an absolute commitment of our lives, perhaps even if that means suffering for it.